Thank you for joining the Education Writers Association for today's webinar about teacher shortages. I'm Rebecca Griesbach. I'm a reporter for AL.com's Education Lab, where I work with a team of journalists covering education issues in Alabama. I'm going to be your moderator for this webinar. And before we begin, let me go over some housekeeping items. First, this is all on the record. I just wanted to remind you all about that. You'll be able to find a recording of this webinar on the website later. And then also a few notes about questions. So if you have a question for our speakers today, please type that into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. You should be able to find that on the side of your screen when you logged in. We also have some EWA staffers here to help you with that if you do have questions. But one other thing, or a couple other things about questions, when you do ask something, please include your name and your affiliation. That'll help us kind of tailor our responses a little bit better. And then also you're welcome to ask a question at any time if it pops up when a panelist is saying something. Just note that we will get to them at the end of the webinar. Also, as soon as the webinar closes, you're going to see an evaluation survey. Please complete that. Your feedback's really important and is going to help EWA improve as an organization. I also wanted to thank EWA for having me and for putting this on. AL.com has been working with a lot of other newsrooms around the country tackling this very topic. And so I'm familiar, especially as a young journalist who came in during COVID, where everyone's kind of like raising the alarms about teacher shortages, about how challenging it can be to kind of report on this topic and wrap your head around all the research, the data, or the lack of data, and just try to find fresh ways to tell stories about it. So I'm really grateful to be able to introduce these panelists who can help us with all of those things and help us improve our coverage of a topic that is not going away anytime soon. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce some of our panelists that we have here today. We have Dr. Chuan Nguyen. He is an assistant professor in the College of Education at Kansas State University. We also have Nima Avashia. She is a veteran Boston Public Schools teacher. And then we have Dr. Lauren Mirando-Rim. She's the executive director of the Center for Learner Equity. And so just so everyone kind of has an idea of our run of show today, we've got about 40 minutes, 35 to 40 minutes for our panelists today. And to kind of keep things focused, I'm going to go one at a time. And we're going to have probably 3 or 4 questions for each one, just to kind of keep things focused as we go along. And then afterwards, we're going to have a fun lightning round and then an audience Q&A. So, first off, Dr. Nguyen, I know you have done a lot of work researching teacher labor markets and kind of challenging this national narrative of teacher shortages as this kind of blanket uniform crisis. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you have found, where some of these shortages or vacancies are more pronounced, and what reporters can learn about your research?
Sure. So first, you know, as you said, the narrative has been that we have a national teacher shortage, right? But in terms of the teacher labor market, we don't have a national teacher labor market. So a teacher in California can't just simply go and teach in, say, Alabama or Florida, right? So it's very, very specific to the state. Now, some states do allow, you know, nearby teachers to transfer, but it's not very easily. And it's definitely not like as if you can just move across the country. So having this idea of the national teacher shortage then kind of blurs a lot of the data and pictures together, right? What we do know is that some states and many, many districts do have a huge teacher vacancy problem. Say, for instance, in Florida, last year they had nearly 4,000 vacant positions. This year, it's closer to 8,000, right? And in many other places like Mississippi, Alabama, there tend to be high number of vacant positions as well. So there's a lot of variations in terms of vacancy across the United States. And then within states as well, you see that some districts are able to fill, teacher openings just fine, but just 10, 20 mile down the street, they may not be able to do that. So there's also variations within state. So for example, in Kansas, in my home state, the western part of Kansas tends to have higher issue with teacher vacancy. So my colleagues and I have been working on this issue for a long time, and we thought surely there must be a federal database that collects information on teacher vacancy across the United States. And lo and behold, there is not. So then we spent a couple of years trying to find all the information we can, scouring the internet, newspapers, Department of Ed websites, to put this information together. So we have created a website, www.teachershortages.com, where we kind of pull all of this information together. We don't think that you can address this problem with a sort of a uniform approach. You have to think about this from a state-to-state basis because we see so much variation on this. So how can journalists approach this topic? So one is the idea of a teacher shortage is actually a bit of a misnomer, because the shortage here can mean two different things. One is vacancy, where districts aren't able to fill the positions, and the other is underqualification, where teachers don't have the right standard certification, or they're teaching out of subject, right? And so we have to separate those two things out. So that's one of the things I think that we can do a better job of making sure, are we talking about vacancy or are we talking about underqualification? In terms of how local reporters can approach this, there's so much local reporters can do. What we found in our search is that so much of this data wouldn't have even existed if local reporters weren't asking their state leaders, the Department of Ed leaders, like, hey, what do we know in terms of teacher vacancy? A lot of this information we found through news report. So having local reporters, that's a lot of time, that's where I'll go to start this process, to say like, hey, what do we know about this? One of the things I think could be done better is if a reporter says, hey, there is a 700 teacher vacancy positions, we would love it if you can document where you get that information. Was it a state leader who, superintendent who said this? Was it a commissioner? Was it from a report? So having that kind of information would be extremely helpful.
I want to go back to data, because as reporters, that's often what we rely on to be able to tackle difficult topics like this, and to identify where those gaps are and where maybe we should focus our attention in our reporting. Can you talk a little bit more about what data does exist and what doesn't, especially when you're talking about vacancies versus underqualifications or certification data? How can we kind of parse that out? What's available, what's not? I mean, I felt that as a reporter, the frustration of like, they're not being exactly what I wanted, but what are some ways that we can, maybe find other data points that might be useful?
Sure. So in terms of, I'll start with the easier one, under qualifications. The Civil Rights Data Collection, the CRDC, collects this information on a 2 to 3 year basis. So they do provide the approximate number of underqualified teachers for every state on a every 2 to 3 years. So that's been very helpful. Some states like Florida actually detailed the number of underqualified teachers and vacant positions every year in their report cards. So that's very helpful. Some states, however, do not provide this information on a regular basis, nor do they provide information on vacancy. Two of the ones that are most surprising to me were California and New York. Now, these two are populous states. They have millions of students, and yet we have gone through the internet, look at their websites, and we could not find information on how many vacant positions there are in the state, right? So as a journalist, just pushing for information like how many vacant positions do we have in this district or in that district would be helpful, because it at least give us a sense of the scale of the problem. But by and large, this information on vacancy in particular is not available publicly or easily on a regular basis.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that frustration as a statewide reporter, not having it all aggregated at the state level,
Hmm.
and that could be frustrating. Um, Another thing that I wanted to ask you, Tuan, was how we can better use research in our reporting. I know for a lot of reporters, and maybe I'll just speak for myself, but research can be intimidating sometimes, and especially, we've seen a lot of kind of preliminary research or surveys that might not have a huge sample size when we're talking about teachers leaving the profession. So
Hmm.
how can journalists sort through that? How can we tell what's good research and what's bad research? And can you just kind of give us an overview of what's out there now and how maybe even a local or a statewide journalist can use that to give more context to their reporting?
Oh, sure. So I know that for a long time, right, and sort of this is a little bit of a thing on in my profession is that we write for academics, right? We don't communicate this to the general public. But over the last 10 years or so, there's been this shift that the research that we do are meaningful, so and it should be communicated to the public, right? Because it should inform policy and public discourse. So many of us now in addition to sort of the academic writing that we do for, journal publications, we also write, policy briefs, and we try to talk to reporters to sort of explain what we're finding in sort of layman's term, right? So it's not written in that sort of dense academic writing. Um, a lot of times, believe it or not, if a reporter, local or state or national, call up the researcher, we're more than pleased to talk with you and sort of break it down in terms of what we're finding, because really we get excited when people are interested in the work we're doing. Um, so like I have talked to dozens and dozens of reporters over the last 3 months over this issue on teacher shortage, and sort of just breaking down what it means nationally about the specific state or specific district. So research can be dense, but I think if you reach out to the researchers, I think they can help you break that down and sort of lower that threshold or anxiety.
Hmm. Thank you for that, Dr. Nguyen. I'm going to move on to Nima Avashia. She previously worked as a civics teacher in Boston Public Schools, and now she's an ethnic studies coach. Nima, can you tell us a little bit about your experience in the classroom? And I'm talking during COVID and also pre-COVID. And what's that like for an educator when there may be vacancies in the school or in the district? And what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know that in some districts, and particularly I think in urban districts, there were vacancies that were happening pre-COVID also, particularly in certain areas that were hard to staff. Finding science teachers has been hard I've been a teacher for 20 years. Finding science teachers was hard for a really long part of that. And so it wasn't like that wasn't a challenge that pre-existed, right? There were certain areas that were hard to staff. There would sometimes be classrooms where you'd have someone who was in that role who wasn't necessarily certified or qualified to be in that role. Um, at the same time, I think that in the context of COVID, all of those pre-existing conditions just got intensified. And the level of sort of need or for bodies, for staff, just became so much higher. Last January, I think in the context of the Delta variant, I mean, there were points where we were like, we were doing math of like, do we have enough adults in the school building right now to safely support the number of students in the school building right now? And you're basically rolling dice of like, how many children are going to be here today and how many adults are going to be here today, and can we figure this out, right? And there's a sort of physical health component that's impacting who's in schools, but there's also sort of um, the mental and emotional toll and the accumulation of being in a profession that was asked to sort of morph and change really quickly, multiple times in an incredibly short span of time without a lot of support. And so I watched colleagues who had been incredibly dedicated teachers for a very long time really lose their footing, and really start to feel like the things that had made them an effective educator, the things that worked, the things that they knew how to do, didn't work anymore. And there wasn't really support around like how to meet the changing needs of the moment. I think about the existing resources that we had pre-pandemic, and in a lot of schools, we didn't have one social worker. And so then it's in the return, it's like, we've now put one social worker in every school. And it's like, well, one social worker in every school doesn't come anywhere near to meeting. It didn't meet the need before, and it certainly doesn't meet the need in the context of like collective trauma experienced by a generation of young people, right? And where does all of that pressure go, and where does all of that weight go? It ultimately comes down to the classroom teacher. And so I think that those material conditions around the work have added a new layer of people who are looking at this job and really asking questions about whether it's something they can continue to do. And that is something that I think is very much a created situation. I don't think it had to be this way, but I think choices that were made around how we were going to return, what we were going to invest in, what we were going to do to support people, really has resulted in a situation where there are people who are not in classrooms right now who really should be, but have chosen to make a different decision.
You talked about social workers, and this is one reason why it's so important to disaggregate some of that data, right, on where the vacancies are. We know kind of generally, maybe not as specifically as we want to know, but we know that generally support staff and specialized roles are really taking a hit. And I know you've kind of talked about this before, but could you tell our audience just sort of what that looks like in the classroom? And you talk about it going all back to the teacher. Tell us a little bit more about what that looks like.
Yeah, I think Lauren is probably going to end up talking about this more also, but particularly in the context of our students who are on IEPs, this has been a tremendous issue, which is that paraprofessionals who do so much of the heavy lifting around supporting students on IEPs, there are significant vacancies around paraprofessionals. And I would say I think that's also in large part due to the way we pay paraprofessionals, and that the salaries that we are offering for that role do not align with the kind of work that is required of that role. And so if I'm a teacher in a classroom and I have been accustomed to having a paraprofessional in the room doing certain support, and then that role isn't filled, I'm trying to be two humans, or some young people's needs aren't getting met. Neither of which is a good option. There are real consequences to that. I think that there is a lot of labor in schools that falls outside of the role teacher that doesn't get included in the conversation. And I think that extends to paraprofessionals. I think it extends to the folks who work in the lunchroom. I think the folks who are on custodial staff, the bus drivers, the bus monitors. There are a whole bunch of people who make up the infrastructure that allows for public school to be a place where all young people are able to come and get support. And many of those roles for a long time have not been paid appropriately. And so those are where you're, in a lot of cases, seeing the biggest number of openings. But it's not something that I feel like is surfacing. Like when the conversation is about teacher vacancies or teacher shortages, it ignores all of these other people who really make school possible. And for many of whom, like those are places where, like, if a child can't get on the bus to go to school because there is no bus driver, like already, like that's a hurdle that, then people in the school are spending their time trying to figure out how to get that kid to school instead of even being able to think about how to teach that child once they're in school.
Right, like it's a whole ecosystem, and one thing is thrown off, then right. How are some ways that, I know there are probably a lot of reporters in here who, are wondering how they can tell that story. Sometimes it's difficult to actually get into a classroom. But, in lieu of that, what are some questions maybe that reporters should be asking, whether it is teachers or support staff, about like what that looks like?
I mean, I think one question that would be really revealing, and I think we could have asked this at every point during COVID, and I wish we had, would be to like ask educators to map their school day and to show what their school day looks like, because so many educators are covering classes where there is a vacant position right now. So many educators are losing their planning time, which was already a very small portion of their day. They're losing that small portion because they have to cover a classroom where there is not a hired staff member there. So I think asking questions like that would reveal some interesting things about what people's school days look like now versus what they look like before and what shifted there. And I do think asking questions about cafeteria staffing and bus routes and in inclusion classrooms, the number of adults who are supposed to be in the classroom versus the number of people who are actually in that classroom would surface some of the vacancies that I think are less easily seen in the current narrative.
One more thing I wanted to ask you was about administration. So, what are some things that we should be asking the district, in particular, I mean, for you and for other staff, what is most helpful and what do you need from administration when you're in a school that has vacancies? And what would you like to see journalists doing when they're trying to assess whether a district is being responsive to those needs?
I think something that's interesting right now about the relationship between a lot of journalists and school districts is that it feels like a shame-based relationship a lot of the time, where it's like, here are all the things that school districts are failing at, and we're going to tell you about them in the media. And I think when that's the dynamic, it's very hard for people to be honest. And it's very hard for people to feel like we're actually all in this work together, which is trying to sort of like make sure young people are getting their needs met and learning in school. So many of these issues live at a structural level. I think we have to figure out how to sort of like take shame out of the equation and be able to acknowledge that like everybody is existing in a structure and system that is not working right now. It has not responded in the ways that it needed to. And that means that it's not about like an individual person's blame or culpability. It's like, what does it mean that we have sort of built this entire ecosystem of school on like exploiting people by not paying them enough and like really not thinking about how we meet young people's needs in schools and adequately staffing our schools for that prior to the pandemic so that when we came back, additional funds would actually meet that need instead of ESSER funds really covering gaps that existed before the pandemic and not being able to meet like the need of the moment, right? I feel like people need to be able to say what they need help with or what's not working for them or what are the obstacles or barriers they're facing that are making it hard for them to staff their schools. And I think for them to do that, we have to figure out how to remove shame from the conversation. So the more we can acknowledge context and system failure, I think the easier it is for then people within school districts to be able to talk about the challenges. But as long as we keep locating blame and responsibility at the individual level, it's going to be really hard for people to talk about what they need.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Nima. I'm going to move on now to Dr. Miranda Rim. I know that your center does a lot of work around students with disabilities and recently published a report about the impact of the pandemic on students with disabilities. Could you tell us a little bit about your findings there and specifically around the role that vacancies play in some of the stuff that we talked about with Nima with those support staff roles?
Definitely. Yes, so I just want to say +1 to what's been shared already, that what kids with disabilities experience, it feels like it's another level of what kids without disabilities experience, and the staffing shortages plays into that in a whole bunch of different ways. We spent a few months we've now released 2 briefs that summarize all the research that we could find, and they're synthesis briefs. So we didn't do original research. We're trying to synthesize and basically try to pull together data to understand the experience of students with disabilities. What we know is that their scores have dropped more. Their scores were low before pandemic, and they've dropped low more. It's been hard for kids with disabilities, especially those with medical conditions, to access school, and parents face trade-offs frequently between health and safety and getting services. We've seen that there have been delays in kids getting identified for special education. So, we've seen in early years fewer kids being identified, and we're expecting kind of a wave of catching up. Thrown into all of that context is the staffing vacancies. And as my colleagues have shared, that is just compounded for kids with disabilities because they typically are interacting with a general ed teacher, a special ed teacher, some specialists, perhaps some paraprofessionals or aides. And when you run into teacher vacancies, then frequently all those supports disappear. So you end up with almost this perfect storm of the kids who have lost the most during the pandemic are the ones who are now getting even less. And so some of the data that we've looked at with staffing vacancies was that there were shortages in special education long before the pandemic. It's always been, you typically hear about science and special education are two areas where we have teacher shortages. And I'm mindful of the language of shortage versus vacancies. When it comes to special ed, it's a little bit of both, but a lot of what drives the vacancies is turnover. And research pointing at some of the working conditions that make it extremely difficult for special ed teachers or paraprofessionals to feel successful contributes to their turnover. So it becomes this kind of negative cycle. One of the data points that was really powerful for us was that we pulled some data and again, just ditto with how difficult it is to get the data, but we had a chance to speak to a professor at the University of Pennsylvania who shared that in the state of Pennsylvania, the number of emergency certified special ed teachers doubled from 218 to 220, fall of 220. So, when we were doing the research, we were like, we don't have that national database, but are there any proxies that can give us a sense of what are districts doing when they don't have enough special ed teachers? And what we saw was that really significant increases in emergency certified. So you've got the students who have the most complex learning needs, typically higher portion being educated by teachers who are emergency certified. And so those could be teachers, that have, maybe have had a semester or some part-time support at night in order to learn how to teach, working with the kids who really have the most complex needs. And that reliance on underqualified teachers really creates a domino effect where the kids fall further and further behind. So that's a quick highlight of the research we've seen, and it's just, there were challenges before, and all of the things we've talked about with COVID have just made that worse for kids with disabilities.
What are some ways that journalists can evaluate whether all children are truly being served by their school system and not just some?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, most, you walk into a school or you look at data and, we talk about children with disabilities as if it's a monolith or a homogenous group, and it isn't. The 13 or 14% of kids in public schools that are identified and have individualized education programs to support their disability, you've got students who have mild dyslexia that might get some specialized reading curriculum, all the way to students who have really significant medical needs who maybe need assistive technology to communicate. So the first thing is when you talk about special education, you need to realize there's nuance. And so I think when you go into a school or you interact with an administrator or administrator or a school-based person, is to ask, tell me about the profile of the kids that you have in the school, and tell me what supports and accommodations you're providing. How are you disaggregating outcomes for kids with disabilities? The vast majority of kids with disabilities, some estimate as high as 85%, do not have a cognitive impairment. So we should reasonably be expecting them, when they get the supports they need, to be able to perform on state tests. So I always listen for high expectations. There are two things. When I go into schools, I listen for high expectations and the degree to which people talk about kids with disabilities as other versus, we provide supports and all kids, and kids are general ed kids first, and they get special ed services second. Special ed is not a place, it's a set of services. So when I go into schools, I listen to how people talk about kids with disabilities. I look at where they're being educated. Are they in a general ed class? Or do they say, here, let me take you to this segregated classroom in the basement and show you the 10 kids with disabilities? And I've had that happen more times than I'd like to admit. So I think asking questions and getting a sense of the expectations and the degree to which kids with disabilities are seen as the responsibility of general ed teachers first, and then getting the supports through their special ed teachers and specialists and therapists on the side.
And this is also, a subset where there's a lot of documentation and a lot of compliance monitoring, right? So what are some ways that reporters can get their hands on some of those documents? Like what all is out there that might be able to give us a clue as to, especially if we're covering maybe a large range of school districts, you know, a clue as to where to focus our attention on?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a lot of things, if one is looking at outcome data. So to look at, and that is one of the, and I know there are not lots of positives, no child left behind, but the disaggregation of data by subgroup was a really important step forward for kids with disabilities, because it used to be that they were just averaged in, and districts that were high performing could mask the performance of kids with disabilities. So disaggregated data to see the performance of the subgroup of kids with disabilities. There's no centralized database of complaints. I mean, you can typically hear about complaints because, a due process complaint wouldn't necessarily reach public view. A state complaint or an OCR complaint, a complaint to the Office of Civil Rights would. There's an organization called the Advocacy Institute that keeps a database of state complaints, in part to try to elevate awareness of them, because there's a host of avenues that a parent could make a complaint. It would be a due process complaint about their child's IEP, or a state complaint, or a complaint to the Department of Ed or Department of Justice around Office of Civil Rights. So the short answer is it's not that easy to do. The kind of backdoor way to do it is that most communities or larger areas have a parent training information center, which is a federally funded center. And so you've got parent advocates. And so going through the door of an organization, and it could be, I've heard that parents are going to TikTok, that their Instagram feeds, Facebook pages, organizations in the community, both general around special ed or by disability type, that those organizations might be a good inroad to interact with parents of kids with disabilities. So yeah, there's kind of official channels versus networking with communities to talk to parents to get a sense of what's going on.
Got it. Well, thank you very much. That's very helpful, especially having to kind of go through the back door on things. I know Alabama actually does keep a lot of those due process complaints, but I understand it can vary by state. Which kind of leads me into my last sort of thing that we're going to do before questions, which is our lightning round. So I'm going to go to each one of you in the same order that we did the panel, and ask each of you for 3 possible story ideas, or even records to request, things that journalists can simple things that journalists can do to maybe strengthen their stories. So Dr. Nguyen, do you have any suggestions for journalists, maybe about specific story ideas or records they could get their hands on?
So one of the things I think that we need to know from more states is the number of vacant positions, right? The number of teachers who are underqualified, how they're being filled. I think so that's sort of from the get-go, that's what we need, right? So the states like California and New York, we need to know what's going on in those states, right? With millions and millions of children, we should know how many are being served by teachers who are, maybe not qualified to be there, who are teaching out of subject, right? At the district and local level, I think one of the most powerful things that journalists can help us with for researchers and for the public policy discourse is how are teacher vacancy distributed among the districts or among schools, right? So that it's not just a matter of like, hey, we are short 1,000 teacher, let's say in Kansas, right? But do we tend to see that in the western part of Kansas? Do we tend to see that in the eastern part of Kansas? Do we tend to see it at high poverty schools? Do we tend to see it at majority minority schools? So breaking that down into the district and specific schools would be really helpful, not only for how we can talk about that, but it would also give a sense of like, hey, what are some possible solutions here that we can think about in order to address those specific issues? And drilling down further, not all, as we've heard here, all vacancy positions are equal, right? Some areas have a really, really high shortage, like STEM or special education. In some states, it's bilingual education that is high needs. In Kansas, it's elementary education, right? So breaking down that vacancy issue into, hey, what specific area are we in need of, would give us a better idea of what's going on.
Thank you. Nima?
I'm a qualitative person over a quantitative person, and I think there is some real value in thinking about what it would look like to profile, like how these shortages or vacancies play out. So for a young person, for an educator, for an administrator, like what does it actually look like in terms of how it is shaping their experience of school or their job? Because I think it's one thing to see the numbers, but it's another thing to really see the impact. If a young person is like not able to get on the bus, right? Or they get to school and then they don't have the paraprofessional who's there one-to-one who's supporting them, or all of these layers, I think would help to sort of really, I think, make this real in a different way. And I think a second question that I would really love to see people look into is, if we were to sort of say that these vacancies are impacting a subset of districts more intensely, whether those are rural districts, whether those are urban districts, are there anomalies? Are there districts that actually are not experiencing high levels of vacancy? And if so, like what have they done in order to prevent that? Because I think that there are really concrete moves that districts could have made around teacher retention that would have mitigated some of these issues, and maybe some have. And if they have, I think it's really important to shine a light on that and say, like, here are concrete steps you could take, whether it is like thinking about career ladders or thinking about retention bonuses or thinking about whatever other pieces. Like, can we figure out who maybe is actually having some success with this and shed a light on that?
So kind of a solutions approach then.
Can I build on that real quick? Because I really like that point. If you can find those stories, right, then what we can do is start thinking about how can we scale that up, right? How can we think about this, doing this in a systematic way? And I think that's one of the things that Nima talked about earlier that really resonated with me, is that this is not an individual issue, not whether or not it is a principal issue or a school issue or a district issue. This is a systematic issue, right? We have built this system to really abuse workers in many ways. That's from teachers to bus drivers to professionals. We haven't provided the resources for them. It's a systematic issue, so we have to think about this in a systematic way, right? So those stories will then help us see sort of the individual responses and narrative, but then we can think about how do we think about this from a system-wide perspective to address these issues.
Definitely. And Lauren, moving on to you, do you have any specific story ideas?
Yeah, I have two, building on what's already been shared. I think that, the recovery funds, the recovery dollars that are flowing out to states and districts had to develop plans for what they were going to do. I think going and looking at those plans, which should be public information that probably buried in school board or board docs, but public information because they're federal grants, to find out what are they proposing to do and what are they proposing to do that's different. Like these are unique problems, and so how have they chosen to use the ESSER dollars? It'd be great to find some bright spots to highlight, but ran into a friend of mine's a paraprofessional and she wants to become a teacher, and she's struggling because the district is saying, well, we can't support you do that. And I was like, there's a huge shortage. You've got somebody who wants to become a teacher and she's mid-career, but there's no avenue. She has to leave work for a year and pay tuition a year. Like the ESSER dollars are there. There's a disconnect between what's happening. And I've had the same thing with a couple of folks I knew in occupational therapist programs. And they said they're paying full boat tuition and there's no connection to this huge shortage and helping people go through programs where giving stipends or covering tuition could really do that. So I think drilling down on the extent to which any districts are being particularly strategic about how they use those ESSER, those recovery dollars to address the shortages, which I think the point of where you get that information is digging into board meetings where they would have had to present a plan or submitted to the state of what they were going to do. the second thing, I can't let the conversation go and not mention discipline. We see that children with disabilities are disciplined 2 and 3 times as much as kids without disabilities, especially Black boys. We think this is going to get worse due to all the things that we've talked about today. So I think tracking discipline data to highlight how the lack of supports and services end up manifesting for kids that lead to behavioral problems in schools. And so districts have to report discipline data to the state and then to the feds. So that is data. It's CRDC, the Civil Rights Data Collection, has it. It's usually a couple years delayed, but I would be looking at discipline issues because I think that is a major, it's a proxy for a whole bunch of problems, or the end result of a whole bunch of problems that we particularly see for kids with disabilities.
Thank you all very much. Those are all very great ideas. I'm sure folks will go back and try to pursue some of them. We have EWA staffer CD Davidson Hires who is collecting questions from the audience. So I'm going to turn it over to her now to ask you some of those for the next 15 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap up. But I just wanted to say thank you all for everything today. It was very helpful to me, and I'm excited to kind of hear what we have from our audience too.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Oh my gosh, thank you so much to everyone who attended the webinar. Thank you to Rebecca for moderating from AL.com. Thank you to Juan, Lauren, and Nima for being here. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm coming off of a Twitter thread that I was keeping of what was being discussed. It was a very quick highlights of some of the things that really caught my attention. But if you want to go check it out, I am at Davidson Hires and follow up with panelists with questions that you may have. Right now, we have opened it up to an audience Q&A. If you do have any questions you want to put in the chat, I will aggregate them and ask them of our panelists. I want to start out with one that I had, though, which has already been covered a little bit in the sense of asking, about public records and specific story ideas that journalists could take back to their newsrooms. But I want to get even a little bit more specific and say, if somebody was writing a story that came out by the end of this week, and you had one question for the district you were most interested in, or one question for an administrator or fellow teacher, what is that? I'll give you 2 seconds to think about it, and then I'll start with Nima.
I would want to know from folks, from school-based people, what they wish had been done differently.
And that's a huge question, and with a huge answer. Can you give us one more specific about that at the administrative level or at the local classroom level?
I mean, I think you could play that out. It really could be like, what does a school leader wish had happened differently in terms of their support from the district? I think it's going to be different depending on a person's location, right? What a classroom teacher sees the answer to that question being versus what a principal sees versus what a superintendent sees. Everyone's sort of like looking one level up, right? And I think the truth is, like, there are moves that could have been made at every level. What I think surface for each layer of this ecosystem, like what folks think could have been done differently.
Oh, that'd be a really good story to tell too at the various levels and compare the answers as well. How about you, Tuan?
I would think about asking, say, a district where they've had some struggles with teacher vacancy problems. How are you addressing those issues now? And more importantly, how are you thinking of addressing them in the future, right? Once ESSER money runs out, right? How are we going to address this problem? Because it's not going to go away. It has been here before the pandemic, right? And it's going to be here after the pandemic. If we don't start thinking about this in a systematic way, we're always going to be just trying to, plug up the holes as the boat is sinking. And that's what's happening now, right? We're not trying to fix the problems of this. We're just trying to do enough to get by. And for some districts, I completely understand that, it was a pandemic, it happens, and they need to do whatever they can to fix it. But for some, that's where it stops. They're not thinking about what's going to happen 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, because the problem with paraprofessionals, bus drivers, teachers, they're not going away. They're gonna be here. They've been here, and it's getting worse in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So already thinking past pandemic times and what worked before and what didn't, and what's going back into place. That would get really into the systemic context that you'd like to see, Nima. And then Lauren, from you, what's a specific question you have?
Yes, I would like to know the degree to which districts are trying to, address the underlying cause of the turnover and the attrition. What investments are you making that will change the conditions that are leading to teachers, and to what degree are you engaging the teachers as collaborators in some of that decision making? I mean, I think the research I've seen, especially on special ed teachers, is that they feel very disempowered. They feel like their work isn't understood. They don't feel like equal partners in the school. And so if you're going to try to solve the problem of why you've got so much attrition, to what degree are you engaging the professionals about the underlying cause of the problem versus just kind of, as Tuan said, just kind of filling the hole in the sinking ship? Because you keep bringing in new teachers, but if the same dysfunction is there and the working conditions don't work for teachers, you're just churning them. So you've got to figure out what's causing the churn and understanding that problem, and that means engaging the teachers, the people that you don't want to leave. So you have to address the attrition issue, and you can't do that without engaging the professionals who are there, who went into teaching because they wanted to teach. And the teachers I've met with who have left, they didn't want to leave. They felt like they had no choice for their own, for their own health or anyway, yeah.
No, it's an incredibly important question, and also one that again gets at the systems issue that's in place, and it's also relevant to COVID when so many districts brought in a committee to advise, and you were having to look at who was weighing in on decisions at the district level. Last moment for anyone to submit a question into the chat if you would like to ask it. I want to go ahead and say thank you again to Tuan, Nima, and Lauren for giving us your time, and Rebecca as well. Very much appreciate you moderating this panel. I also would like to thank everybody who attended and remind you that as soon as the webinar closes, you will see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is important to us and helps us improve our membership programming. Finally, visit ewa.org/events to sign up for our upcoming online and in-person seminars. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. You will see this webinar posted to our site shortly if you want to catch up to it. And thank you so much, everyone.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.